really happy to be here and see so many people coming to spend a summer Saturday afternoon out of pure concern, interest, commitment about the climate emergency. So I'm going to just give a few remarks before I turn this over to Dr. Mark Jaccard. And I'm going to start by acknowledging that we're here on the unceded ancestral territories of the Coast Salish First Nation, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. I want to thank the Kitsilano Community Center for hosting us in this space today. And I'm going to note that we are filming this event just because there are people, as we had a MP breakfast and there were many people who weren't able to make it. We filmed it so that those that wanted to see it could on their computers. We're filming it again today, and I think this is Facebook Live, is that correct, Jonathan? So hello to anybody who's already watching now on Facebook Live. So if anybody is uncomfortable being filmed, please talk to my staff afterwards and we'll make sure that that's taken care of so that you don't need to worry about it. Let's see, we have a no filming zone, and that is the section over to the left. So if that's something that you'd like to do, please feel free to move over to that section. So I just wanted to make a few quick points before, as I mentioned, Dr. Jaccard takes over. One is, I am convinced, and I think many of you are, that the climate emergency is the defining issue and urgent crisis of our time and needs action. Thank you. And secondly, since 1992, when I started studying this for my thesis for my MBA, which was on global warming and a Canadian approach to taking a leadership on this, it has been a key driver for me. And I've done many climate events. You've been to them, so many of you will have heard this already. But when I finished writing my thesis, I took it around to try and interest decision makers in it. So I went to Toronto, I met with a vice president of Ontario Hydro. I went to Ottawa and met with senior people in Natural Resources Canada. I went to Victoria, etc. And I didn't get very much interest in this at the time, 1992, 1993. And so eventually when I went into provincial politics in 2000, 2001, it was because of my conviction that I needed to try and become a decision maker in position to take action myself. It was hard to get people to take it seriously back then. So it's been fundamental to my service as a politician over the years. Thirdly, I would say that in British Columbia, the issue of climate action by our government is complicated. And it's complicated by the decision to approve a pipeline expansion and indeed invest in that expansion. And this relates to a way to have Alberta at that time take action that would be significant and necessary to help us achieve our Paris targets. But it does make a complicated story, and I think that's part of what Mark has been able to work his way through over the years as a key expert on the issue, and I'll get into that in a moment. The fourth point I want to make is this has become so political and polarized of a discussion, especially in places like the United States, in the UK. Gee, I wonder what's on my mind about the UK these days. But also in France, where we had a president that almost lost his position because of the negative reaction to his intent to up the price on pollution in France. So So it's, we have to be guided by science. We cannot let this be a political football that divides citizens in Canada based on their party affiliations, and then we become a more polarized and partisan and populist politics in Canada. So I think making decisions based on research, on science, on good public policy is absolutely critical. And so that brings me to our special guest today. So was anybody at the MP breakfast that Dr. Jaccard was at in June, just to have a sense? Okay, so some of you have come back for more. And we had over 50 people who weren't able to attend. We had such an outpouring of interest. Mark kindly agreed to bring his message to another event because we had so much interest. Now, Mark is someone who has authored books, a number of books on climate change and climate change policy. Some have been critical of the Liberal governments, some have been on other matters. He has been a senior consultant to leaders in places like China, the US, the Canadian government, and British Columbia. So Mark and I have known each other for many years, and he was the first person I turned to when I was the provincial environment minister, and we worked together to lay a foundation for the climate action that our province took in 2007, 2008 to provide leadership in good public policy on climate at that time. So Mark was a key partner in that and informed the work that I was doing as a minister and as a member of a caucus trying to push my other colleagues on that issue. So I am I'm very grateful that he's here today. He's nonpartisan. He will talk to you about a book that he's writing or has written. And is it in the stores now, Mark? Okay, so not yet. And just before I just wanted to recognize one person in the audience, which is Betsy McGregor from Ontario, is a friend that has just launched a book that's called Women on the Ballot. So she's a campaigner as well, and her campaign is around having more women in politics. And so I was, she's a huge mentor and trainer, and her book Women on the Ballot has just hit the bookshelves and is a fabulous read. So thanks for coming, Betsy. All right, so Mark, thank you, and I'm going to turn this over to you, and it's your show. So thank you very much for being willing to do this today.
Yes, some of you know that as part of Joyce's bringing in speakers of public interest, I know you've been doing this for a long time. I think I did one several years for you as well, but I did one recently. And so apologies to those of you who were at the first one, but there's a lot of repetition here. But some people tell me, you know what, I really like to see the slides a second time. And all the slides will be available, by the way, anyway. And when I'm speaking, I'm really getting a pickup here. It's like you're blowing my ears. Okay, great. You can take it, plate down. Yeah, so what I'm going to try to do is we have until about 3 o'clock, and I'm really interested in getting into a back and forth of question and answer, a civil back and forth of question and answer, and I have a civil group of people here. And so I'm going to try to speak in just in maybe 35 to 40 minutes, and that'll give us a lot of time for question and answer. We've got 3 people with microphones. I'll do this thing where I ask you to put up your hand and I'll count you off. You're number 1, 2, 3, 4, and they'll try to find you so that we can speak in a fair order. And don't be timid. Anybody, just get my attention. I will say, though, that this is not a session about climate science. If you're here and you disagree with the consensus of scientists I'm not going to be able to answer your questions for you, so you should go and ask them somewhere else, or make your statements somewhere else. So we're just not going to go there. But I will say in passing, that people like to say, well, because 97% of scientists agree on climate science. That's not true. It's 100%. It's 100% of the leading climate scientists in the world agree on what Tyndall found out 200 years ago about infrared and ultraviolet light and how they pass through and are affected by different chemicals that are in the atmosphere. There's been no doubt about that. So I'm just wanting to say, when I go to a public event like this, there's usually one or two people who come in and they have an agenda, and I'm sorry, this isn't the place for that. So I'll get on with my talk. This is, to me, climate policy is always important. People say, well, there's an election coming up. Well, to me, there's always some election somewhere coming up. We need to be talking about this all the time. And so my objective for this talk, so the climate scientists, they're trying to do better at communicating climate science. Trying to get, you're never going to get everybody to understand, get a higher percentage of people. It was like the challenge of smoking and lung cancer. Can you get more people to understand that? And that's their job. Smoking and lung cancer, on a policy point of view, is actually a fair bit easier. Like, government's already taxed cigarettes, they could raise the taxes, they could do education programs, they could put labels on cigarettes. Policy, when it comes to greenhouse gas reduction, is very challenging. And we knew this 3 decades ago when I first started working in this area, and we still know it. And so a lot of my talk, and so that means this could be an audience of people, and many others, 65, 75% of Canadians, very concerned about climate and want to see policy, and yet the policy doesn't happen, the effective policy. Instead, it's like stuff that looks like it's making a difference. Or, targets that are ambitious, but what does that really mean? What's backing it up? And the purpose of my talk is to help people with that. And so, and that is why the book that is finished and is being published, but it won't come out for another several months, Cambridge University Press, and I'll talk about it at the very end of my talk. But the content that I'm covering is from that book, although in a Canadian context, because my book is more general, US audience, wherever. So the objective is to help Canadian citizens do a better job of identifying climate-sincere politicians and electing and supporting those politicians, and then the corollary being to identify and oppose the climate-insincere politicians. And this slide, I've got about 14 slides. Don't be alarmed that I spent a lot of time on this one slide. But I feel it's so important to have this slide at the beginning of my talks, because there's sometimes a lot of naive assumptions we make, like, we'll just reduce our emissions, and why aren't we doing that? And then the person who is attached to the oil industry says, but that won't make any difference. What's going on in India or China? So my talk is really going to be about how we connect what we're doing globally, and that's also part of being a sincere politician. So these are the kind of things that we'll look for. So I have to start out by making sure we understand globally, and even in a domestic context, whether it's British Columbia's government or Vancouver's government or Canada's government, also why climate policy is difficult. And I'll use this term deep decarbonization because most of our greenhouse gases are from burning coal, oil, and natural gas, the fossil fuels. So that means gasoline in your car, natural gas in your homes. That's how you and I are causing this problem. And so when we say deep decarbonization means we either stop burning those things, or if we're using them somehow, we're converting them and capturing the carbon. And that's what deep decarbonization is. And we talk about it as we have an energy system that globally is about 85% based on coal, oil, and natural gas. In Canada, it can be a little less than that because we have a lot of hydropower in some areas like BC and Quebec. But deep decarbonization means you're really transitioning your energy system. Now, it isn't just about the energy system, but actually do the energy system, and a lot of the other stuff will be easier. Don't do the energy system and forget the other stuff. Like, you've got to do the energy system. It's a global collective action problem, right? Because it's the atmosphere. The emissions are mixed in the atmosphere. So we have to act globally to deal with this. It's like the threat of Nazi Germany or an asteroid coming towards the Earth. Well, maybe with an asteroid, one country could take care of it. But in the global, emissions from anywhere on the planet have to be reduced and driven down towards zero. But we don't have good global governance institutions. And in this chaotic world we live in today, I don't need to tell you about that. We sometimes, because of the news, we think of it as really chaotic. Actually, it's been very chaotic in the past, even much more so. We're actually improving, one could argue, on global governance. The other is that people have really different perspectives. So something that I'll talk about a bit in this talk, and maybe it'll come up more in question and answer, is human bias. And my book is very much about that, about how all of us can be guilty of seeing things in a way that relates to our own self-interest, and that biases us on the evidence. So people have said to me, well, we should just quickly allocate how much reduction should happen in each planet. So Canada should reduce its emissions by X amount. That's part of a fair global settlement. And I'll say, well, where did you find out about the fair global settlement? Because when we hear these negotiations once a year, and then major times at Paris in 2015 and Kyoto in 1997, you realize there's a huge disparity. If some people will say, oh, well, actually, we should just charge people for emissions, and so you should pay for your pollution. And then it's like, well, what about poorer countries that are trying to develop? So maybe the payment should be based on your ability to pay rather than the pollution you cause. And then it just goes on and on from there, all these different perspectives, ability to pay, willingness to pay, historical emissions. Shouldn't you pay for all your country pay for the ones in the past? Or how do you resolve this? And so we can't get an agreement. And I'm going to argue in a later slide that we are very unlikely to get it voluntarily. And so when we think globally on this, we need governments at the national level that are really starting to work with people on actions that are global and that even have to play a bit of hardball, so tariffs and so on. And that would be my message to the Trudeau government. I'm going to say that they've done good things. I think they should be doing more. It's not popular to do these kind of things. And then, of course, I already gave this example that country leadership is really hindered because it is a global problem. So, us who are really concerned say to our government, get going. And I'm going to show you there's some real challenges to a government that wants to get reelected to go fast on this, because the standard argument is we are only a small percentage of emissions. And, even China can make that argument. They're about 25% of global emissions. I've done calculations where they reduced their emissions significantly, and it still didn't matter, right, for the climate change. So we're all in that boat when it's a global collective action problem. You need to figure out a way to get others to act. Now, even if solving the climate problem, deep decarbonization, even if it was something we only need to do in your own country, what if greenhouse gases were like urban air pollution or water pollution in the Okanagan lakes? And we didn't need global cooperation to address it. It was a local environmental problem. And I'm going to argue that even if greenhouse gas, like if Canada reduced its greenhouse gases and we were spared climate change, it happened all around us, Alaska, but not in the Yukon. Even in that kind of scenario, it's very difficult to do climate policy, and this is the crux of my talk. One is that fossil fuels are incumbent, just meaning that gasoline is what most people are using in their cars. Natural gas is what many are using in their buildings. We still have provinces using coal to make electricity. So, or people are supplying it. They're actually producers on a global scale. So, Alberta producing oil, for example, and exporting it, and wanting to export more of it and develop more of it. So what happens is those corporate and regional interests are biased to sustain the fossil fuel dominance and to convince society of the continued benefits. So that's a distortionary effect. And I don't even, I don't have to dwell on this lately with the election of Jason Kenney and his putting taxpayers' funds and so on into a campaign I'll call it a propaganda campaign. The other thing, though, is that with greenhouse gas reduction, because this is sort of a longer transformation that I've been talking about, decarbonization, you're not going to stop using gas. You're not going to change all the cars from gasoline to electric in 2 years, or all the houses away from natural gas. And so that is, whereas if you elect a politician and say, we want more hospital beds, you can kind of measure that 4 years later in the next election. With greenhouse gas reduction, politicians says, I'm putting things in place, and over a 2 or 3 decade period, they will transform the energy system away from burning fossil fuels. So you see what happens? It's a perfect place for Brian Mulroney in 87 to set a target for the year 2000, 13 years away. And then even though he was sincere in many ways, not put in the policies that would do that. And it was easy for Jean Chrétien in 1997 at Kyoto to set a target for 2010, 13 years away. And then not put in the policies that would do that. And then Stephen Harper to follow up, realizing, oh, hey, I just figured out a formula here. And he set a target, I think he was 1 year off, in 2006. And he refused the Kyoto target of 210, he did 220. He was 14 years away and did nothing. So you see the repeating policy problem, and it didn't matter if it was, in this case, a liberal conservative government. So you can fake it because a few screaming academics like me are in the newspaper writing op-eds, doing analysis, showing those policies won't do anything. Sometimes the Auditor General, I've worked for Auditor Generals as a consultant across the country. Those reports come out, the media does it, and then everything moves on. So the politicians have figured that out, the insincere ones. And even worse, you can lie. It really is amenable to lying. So you can say to people, this carbon pricing is going to increase the cost of gasoline, it's going to make your life miserable, it's not going to do anything. And not everybody believes that. But it only takes a small percentage of people to help win an election in Canada. And it can be people in the suburbs who drive more, feel they have less options for using something other than the car, and that can make a difference. So I've taken some time on that, but that's so critical, because even when we get into question period, I just know this from experience, I might refer you back to this slide and say, but remember what we talked about and why that's a challenge. Now I'll go faster. So one of the things you need to do is say, if I'm going to figure out when is a politician doing the right thing, okay, so we've got to reduce CO2 in the atmosphere. Now I've got a list of 4 things there. I teased Joyce that I put that top line in there because I know she's always worked so hard on afforestation, reforestation, and so on. And that is important. It's a difficult one, actually, and you know that by what's going on in Brazil right now today, if you've been following the news. Energy efficiency, but energy efficiency is tricky too, because people will say, let's do energy efficiency, but in fact, humans are going to use a lot of energy. And so really, the most important one here is fuel switching to renewables, perhaps nuclear, or perhaps with capturing, not total fuel switching, but capturing the carbon. And so you might still use energy from fossil fuels. Alberta could still be developing its oil sands and producing hydrogen from it and capturing the carbon and putting it underground. And they have all the technologies to do that, by the way. So right now, we're doing that when we're making electricity from coal in Saskatchewan. Sask Power is burying CO2 underground. And we've got a factory now that we're building that is going up in Squamish called Carbon Engineering, that some of you may have heard of, which is actually not even at the flue stack. It's actually extracting CO2 right out of the atmosphere. And that's quite amazing because it's a very low concentration in the atmosphere. It's a challenging prospect. But there are scientists who realize and engineers, we're not getting far enough, fast enough on the whole policy, political side. Humans are going to be turning to what we call, sometimes called Hail Mary or sort of last gasp technological solutions. And I've been convinced of that for 15 years. And so I understand why people work on these issues. Carbon engineering is in Squamish, funded partly by Bill Gates, and an old friend of mine, David Keith, who's a professor at Harvard, was the brains behind that. So what are the key policies? Well, there's only two. So this makes it easy for you. A politician is either pricing carbon, or they're putting in regulations that say you've got to be moving to zero-emission vehicles, or we've got to be replacing the natural gas that comes to our homes with methane. And that means if the price goes up, well, then people will buy electric heat pumps. So it's either regulations or it's pricing. And one can't, policies and actions, what's their relationship? It's policies that cause actions. And so politicians will often say, oh, I'm not going to do this policy, I'll do this action. There's a very big signal for you right there. Don't trust them. They shouldn't have mentioned an action. They should have said which policy. So Andrew Scheer, and I am going to be bashing Andrew Scheer a bit, so cover your ears if you love Andrew Scheer. But I don't find anything he's done as being sincere when it comes to climate, at least to greenhouse gas reduction. So he put out his climate plan in June and said, and the big title on it, or 3 pages in, says, no to carbon tax, yes to green technology. Did you get the trap? You don't get the green technology without a carbon tax or a regulation. They're not substitutes. One causes the other. But it sounds great. Doesn't it sound great? Like, we don't need taxes, we'll just get green technology. How do you get green technology? I have a slide here that people have said is helpful. And so I'm going to just spend a little bit of time on it. So what I've done is just mapped out how we can organize your policy options. Because, and it's funny, just in the last few days I was helping the Yukon government, their staff, so I can't say too much details, it's not public yet, but people will come up with long lists of all the things we're going to do. And my job is to say, and my researchers, you know, wait a minute, what was the policy that causes actions? Don't put actions in your list. And then we want to know, did they put in what I just told you, carbon pricing, selective carbon tax, I'll explain, or regulations. And instead, if they just said, oh, well, you know, so what Andrew Scheer, if you deconstruct his policy plan, it says, work with the electric utilities to stop using coal. Work with the vehicle manufacturers to stop selling gasoline. Oh, he doesn't even say that. But those are all like suasion, more information, put labels on fridges, maybe a few subsidies, and maybe a few things with government buildings. And I mean, these are all things that any government should be doing, but they're not a substitute for these other policies. So if you see the government just doing this, there's a dead giveaway right there. So, I mean, our current government is doing this, both in British Columbia and federally, and they're doing some of this, but here's where I look. And I say, okay, maybe some of this, some subsidies, it's good candy, window dressing. I certainly took advantage of the subsidy when I bought an electric car, and now I'm just redoing my house for electric heat pump, and I get another subsidy. But I would have done that anyway. But those are things that can help other people move along, but it's the carbon pricing and the regulations that drive it. I also wanted to point out, and this is where I'll just spend a little bit of time in this talk, we economists, we'll tell you gotta have a carbon tax, and that's not really true. That's why my last slide said carbon pricing and or regulations. You can do it all with regulations. You can do it all with the carbon pricing. And also these split. Carbon tax is what we have in British Columbia, and the federal government has now implemented with a backstop carbon price so that it would be fair across the country. You can't be in jurisdiction. Alberta just elected a government that promised to get rid of its carbon tax, which is modeled on BC's. And the federal government is going to come along and say, sorry, you can't do that, that's cheating. We're going to make sure all Canadians face the same price. You could do it with something called cap and trade. So California and Quebec belong to the same cap and trade system. You put a cap on emissions, you allocate out permits, and the trading price of those permits raises the price of gasoline in the same way that a carbon tax raises the price of gasoline. And then, but what I want to point out is that, you know, we economists often say, oh, regulations, they're prescriptive, meaning you've got to buy this kind of car, or you've got to get that kind of fridge or furnace. And most regulations aren't like that anymore. Industry stepped in as governments regulate, economists have stepped in and said, if you make it more flexible, it can be more economically efficient. Like people can pick the lowest option, not some technology you told them that they had to have. That's why British Columbia today has something called a zero emission vehicle standard. Notice it's not an electric vehicle standard. It's zero emission, and then they have a broad definition of that. It could be a pure electric car, it could be a plug-in hybrid electric car, and even certain biofuel type cars can, in some cases, get under those categories. So that's why I just, when I show this breakout, again, it's this right here that will distinguish sincerity from insincerity. You still need to know when you get down here, how stringent were their policies? Like, was it just a $1 per ton of CO2 carbon tax, or was it a serious policy? So you gotta be vigilant. So I'm not going to show the slide on flexible regulations. I think that there are more questions about that. We have those policies here in British Columbia, and the federal government's implementing them. But I'm going to move on to, where am I? I might skip this one too. So this is, we did some, it takes me a while to explain, but in British Columbia, as Joyce pointed out, we had this period, especially 2006 to 2008, and it's true that Joyce did a lot of the groundwork for that, where in his second term, the Gordon Campbell government really got serious about climate and implemented what are those effective climate policies, regulations and pricing. And because he took kind of a shotgun approach, he did all those things at once. It was very hectic for friends of mine who worked in ministries. They disappeared for 2 years writing legislation. And because he did that, though, later on, when people said, well, how do people respond to a carbon tax? How do they respond to a regulation? For me as an academic, British Columbia was a perfect, we call it a quasi-experiment. It meant that we had a situation where everybody had to look at a bunch of things. Did you like the carbon price more or less? So we surveyed several hundred British Columbians. And I'll just leave that there for you as a teaser if someone wants to ask about that in questions. But I'm going to try to, I don't think I need to talk about that right now. So I'm going to summarize though. Climate insincere politicians will deliberately confuse actions and policies, and they should only be talking about the policies they're going to implement. They don't buy everybody a refrigerator. They have to implement a policy. If they're insincere, they will avoid compulsory policies, the ones that I consider pricing and or regulation. Or they'll lie about the compulsory policies, especially the best target for them, and that was the slide we would show you, is carbon pricing. It's fairly easy to convince some people, a small percentage, that this carbon price is horrendous. It's penalizing them and it's harming the economy, as I already said. And if they do go with compulsory policies, they won't be meaningful stringency. So the carbon price will be very low, or the regulation really won't bite. It'll be an electricity or a zero-emission vehicle regulation that actually is not even catching up to the market. So it's not really doing anything. Climate-sincere politician then obviously will be doing the opposite. Pricing and or flex regs of some kind and rising stringencies. And this means that independent analysts, they will agree with independent analysts about, oh yeah, that's the effect of our policies. And I have to say, and that's my critique of the Mulroney, the Chrétien, and the Harper governments, was that they just kept challenging what us independent experts were doing in terms of analysis. And that's why auditor generals would hire me and others to review that. And a huge breath of fresh air with the Trudeau government in 2015 is they stopped all of that. And they said, we've got a parliamentary budget office. We also, in the two ministries, whether it's Natural Resources Canada or Environment Canada, they develop models. These are energy economy models. You don't need to know much about it, that I've been developing for years and others. And we'll use the standard ones So when the Trudeau government has spit out what its estimate of its emissions are, people like me come up with the same numbers, very close. Now, I want to return to the global collective action problem, but I don't even think I should show this either. It's just the point I made earlier that a voluntary global agreement is highly likely. And this was, I actually hunted down the cartoonist of this, and I paid him a small fee to get this in my book. And you know, it's almost, probably shouldn't, I didn't expect to get guffaws of laughter. It's funny, but it's also sad, because it strikes too close to home. The point I'm trying to make with this slide is I don't believe we'll ever get a voluntary agreement for those reasons that I talked about. And that means we're going to need national governments that find other governments that team together and put tariffs on. It's too bad that Donald Trump couldn't get excited about carbon tariffs. He loves tariffs. And there's people in his administration trying to change it apparently, but that's what we're going to need to have. And we need to be talking about that all the time. And we need, if the Trudeau government was reelected, we need it talking about this all the time. It's hard. So, and now, so what about those actions? Remember I said, so you've got to do all these things, like fuel efficiency, fuel switching, and so on. Well, what about, where do we do them? So where do we emit, right? We emit, it's really simple. It's driving around, it's heating your home, it's somebody generating your electricity. That's all clean in BC because of the rule we passed under the Campbell government. And it's industry, when they're making various products. And then there's other stuff on farmhouses and in the forests and so on, but this is really the big areas. And guess what? You have to be thinking about, again, this global thinking, where are the emissions coming from in the rest of the world and where will they come from? How do we strategically focus on certain sectors? And there's another part of it. Remember I said it's a global collective action problem? So what happens if we reduce our emissions in our buildings or in our transportation or our electricity? Those are domestic sectors. They won't affect our economy other than the cost of making that transition. What if we tell industry, oh, steel industry, drop your emissions to zero. The cost of steel that it's trying to export will go up 40%. What if its competitors in other countries are not doing that? What about aluminum? What about cement? What about chemical products, plastics? All the same thing. So you have to, so a climate insincere, or like, you know, might say we can get it all from industry, those nasty polluters. But it's actually, to make this a global solution, it's going to be flipped. The country in itself has to leave industry alone, believe it or not, until we can get a global agreement and just focus on where we can flip in our own country. And even if you're a social democrat and NDP supporter, this is what social democratic countries in Scandinavia are doing right now. They're flipping their building sector, their transportation sector, and they've flipped already their electricity sector, and they're working on industry, but they go slower there. So, and how do I know we need to focus especially on electricity and transportation? I'm going to explain with this slide. This is, we've taken work from the International Energy Agency and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and said, here are OECD countries, so right, the industrialized countries, Europe, US, Canada, Australia, Japan, and what are their emissions of CO2 going to be in 2050? And likewise, the non-OECD, so China, India, and the rest of the developing world, which as you can see, at one time, not that long ago, their emissions were less than OECD emissions. They're already greater, and they would be way greater, that the pies represent the relative emissions. But here's what's interesting. This is electricity generation in those developing countries. So if you can stop burning coal, burn very little natural gas, start using wind, solar, you're taking care of a huge amount of the CO2 emissions, just in those two sectors. And you can do that without having a global agreement. And likewise, in the OECD, and then the transport liquids, so this is our transportation sector, which also we can switch to electricity and biofuels. And it's the same, and over here it's even more than 50% in countries like ours. So that's what I mean about being strategic. What we need to do and how we should judge our governments right now well, look at Scandinavia. It's how fast are they flipping the electricity sector? How fast are they flipping the transportation sector and the building sector? So, but especially just those two. So electricity transport greater than 50%. So, thinking globally, acting locally, and globally, leading countries must rapidly decarbonize electricity and transportation. Low cost, because we have commercially available technologies, even in transportation. It won't cost that much more than using electricity and biofuels. Huge benefits for developing world, because the Chinese, who's the biggest producer of electric cars right now? It's the Chinese. Why are they doing it? Well, I think they're trying to get ahead of, so they can be major exporters, but they're very concerned about urban air quality. And you're going to be able to, electric car regulations or zero emission vehicle regulations are going to be coming in, I would think, in a lot of the major cities of the developing world. And that can be good news if we make sure the electricity that they're using is from zero emission sources. I already talked about the whole taxation side of this, create clubs of countries that make pledges. So Canada has been the leader in the last couple of years in starting the Powering Past coal line. So that the Trudeau government came in and said we're going to phase out coal plants across Canada, but we know that you're just hanging out there because it always begs the question, yeah, but what about the coal plants they're building in India, blah, blah, blah. So they're trying to start a global coalition. But that coalition eventually won't just be about giving people some money, because we as taxpayers will never be generous enough to pay enough for India to only put up wind and solar. It's going to be tariffs as well. We need to talk real politics about that. Other sectors, I've already kind of said this, there's things you can do. Again, look at Scandinavia, but I'm not going to spend time on that right now. I want to keep moving. So what is our current climate effort? I'm summing up here now. Since 2015, Canada has its first climate sincere federal government by the criteria that I've been measuring for you. And I can happily say this is nonpartisan because nobody hammered the criteria government more than I did. I've CD Howe report after CD Howe report and published a book when I could see that they were not doing sincere policies to achieve the Kyoto target. And now it's a different government. How do we know? So reliance on pricing and regulations, whose effect by 2025 to 2030 can be predictably estimated by people like me, and they're seeking to sort of extend or parlay their domestic efforts into a global effort, but they should be doing more than. Specific evidence, so we have the coal plant phase out, the economy-wide carbon price, methane regulations, clean fuel standard, and that's a flex reg that I didn't explain, and I won't, but I can in question. A system that prices emissions in industry, but only sort of some of the emissions, so that the cost of making steel or chemicals doesn't rise so much that we just wipe out our industrial sector, because they would lose out to competitors in countries that were not enacting climate policies. And then other kinds of things, there's been a lot of money towards infrastructure. We know that even for the extension of the subway in Vancouver. So I just recently put out something, I'll just put it all up here, in policy options on August 21st. If you Google policy options, you'll find my article. It's a very short article, 1,000 words. And because what I did is I and some of our researchers, we simulated the sheer policies, none of which are compulsory, and therefore emissions rise with the Trudeau policies. The Trudeau policies right now still don't achieve Paris. You can turn up the stringency of these after an election or two, and we will get very close. So I'm not really troubled by that. But that's a real stark. So for me, that's a real stark contrast. The top one is business as usual, but what Canada's been doing. This is a radical change. I'm going to just summarize the Greens and NDP because I think that can come up in questioning if you want. So I've got this slide. The NDP, they both have stronger targets. Now that's always so, but I don't want you to measure people by targets, right? Because anyone can make up any target. Stephen Harper made up great targets. I do believe that the Greens and NDP are far more sincere than Stephen Harper was. But I'm going to be interested in what policies they're using to get there and what will be the challenges in how they do that. And I have issues with it. I'm not going to go into that now because I really want to get to question period. And the Greens, and Elizabeth Greene, I count her as a good friend, and they do listen to me when they're designing policies, and I've also helped the MVP several times over the last decades. Again, a much more ambitious target. What will that mean? It means a dramatic transformation in the economy in a very short time period, and it will be really expensive. But in defense of the Greens, they've also put a lot of thought into how that transition happens. Because there's a lot of job creation at the same time as well, obviously, in making clean electricity, clean biofuels, and so on. And they've put a lot of thought into that. So I'm just going to sort of leave you with that right now, and I'm happy to go back to that in question period. I know that's very superficial at this point. So what responsibility for citizens? This is not meant to be a fun chart. This is actually how I end my book. That it's sort of students of mine helped me with this because it's got sort of this engineered chart diagram or decision thing. Basically, you have a wide range of things you have to think about. So remember, I already talked to you about how do we figure out sincerity. Are there targets? Well, are the targets linked to policies? And are those policies pricing, and I put standards here, or regulations? And are there no loopholes? And I won't even get into that. Well, then you better be supporting that politician and trying to get them reelected. If you're in another world, then you're in, like I do believe that this is the dire issue of our time. And that is why in the Harper era, and we were trying to get more Canadians to think about this government's not doing anything, I got arrested in White Rock to block a coal train. That's civil action. I believe in that. But it's also why I didn't get arrested to try to stop the Trans Mountain Pipeline, because I was more interested in the sincerity of this government as I perceived it, even though I oppose the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And I've also have slides for that, but I'm just leaving them for the question period if anyone has some questions about it. Okay, so what prospect? Oh, then I think I'm going to be finished. This slide is about Alberta. So it's about what do you do when people are biased, and we're all biased, but they're biased by a way that would increase greenhouse gas emissions or prevent us from lowering them. And actually all I have on here, I don't want to, is just a chart showing beliefs about smoking and lung cancer and how they evolved over 4 decades in the US, and another chart, beliefs of climate science and how they evolved, and how you could, in smoking, you could say, oh, smokers were biased, like their beliefs were not the same as the average for society. They didn't want to believe the science, even if they were doctors. And in the case of climate, it can show you that regions that are dependent on using fossil fuels or actually producing them for export, take much longer. And in both cases, they're US data. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to let you stare at it for a while because I don't think that's a good use of our time. So, but I mean, if you ask me a question, then I'll let you stare at it and I'll point to a few points. That sounds like I'm hiding stuff, and I didn't mean to get you to laugh at that. Anyway, so here's an ad for the book. And it will be free online at Cambridge University Press. Thank you very much for your attention. I really look forward to us having a robust question and answer period. Thank you very much. So please raise your hand if you have a question. And so I'm just going to do something here. Yeah, don't be shy. So you're number 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we're starting, yes, you're 4, and you're 5. So we're going to start on this, okay, and you're 6, and then I'll come over here after we've done with them. All right. And so please keep this isn't your chance to make a big statement, this is your chance to ask a precise question. And I mostly will be concise in answers, although sometimes I may use it to explain a longer point. Please go ahead.
It's another book, not this book, but another book.
Okay.
And one thing I noted about the book is that Canada is number 2 in terms of per capita emissions, behind the United States, which is number 1 per capita emissions of greenhouse gas emissions. And at this time, there's a candidate called Bernie Sanders, who's running for president, who proposed a $16.3 trillion plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Do you think policies that radical is what's necessary in Canada?
So did y'all hear that? Just about, so it's quite funny because I've actually been interacting about 6 months ago with Barry Sanders' policy team. They got a hold of me about flex regs, and so we had several exchanges. And I was just reading his policy thing this morning. And so when you say that radical, so maybe when we start to talk about the NDP or the Green Deal, he's talking about this. I didn't see all the policies. I looked and looked and looked, and I didn't see. So remember, what am I doing? I'm looking for where's the carbon pricing, and I don't think I saw that. I was going to say several things this morning. I was looking for regulations. I think I saw some of those, like the one on electricity that we implemented in BC 10 years ago. And but you know, if he got into power, I don't think his policies will be, I mean, so first of all, him in power, he needs a Congress and a Senate to do a lot of things. So here's what Obama did. Obama was trying to make change, and he couldn't get a Congress and Senate to do stuff with him, right? So he used his executive powers. Where did he work on? Electricity and transportation. So I believe if Sanders got elected, he would be doing a continuation of what you saw with Obama in those sectors. If he got the wider support, I would love it if the United States implemented a cap and trade like they almost implemented under Obama. Basically, it's that way. So I wouldn't give him credit for being more radical, because it's all the other criteria, and that was in my Green and NDP part, is how close are you to being elected? Is that, you know, on that platform? So that's what we need. We need people who are willing to compromise and get elected. Because it's another thing to just say, here is my radical policy. Oh yeah, I know I won't get elected, but it sounds great saying this stuff. Now I know Bernie really intends to get elected, and he's a very serious and good candidate. But I'm just saying, will that have to change either before getting elected or once you are elected? And I think there's a lot of reasons to vote this. Who was number 2?
Hi, thank you. Casey, this isn't an overview question. It's really more specific about the natural gas industry here. So the natural gas industry here in British Columbia, our frack gas and the exportation and the new terminal that's being proposed that the NDP has approved. I'm just wondering how that fits into an overall framework of greenhouse gas reduction and transition.
Thank you for that. So there's I'm glad you asked it on sort of the greenhouse gas side. There are concerns people have about fracking as a local environmental problem, you know, seismicity, water, and so on. There are lots of people who believe if you regulate that industry properly, there are examples where it's been done well. I'm not going to address that. I am someone who tries to never have really strong positions about any particular option, because I think we can't be perfectionists right now. We need to compromise. So I don't have strong positions on, you know, whether we should ever be allowed to frack. If you ask me about British Columbia becoming a natural gas exporter, how does that fit into the global climate issue? It's a very difficult question as well. I'll tell you why. If it were coal, so the International Energy Agency and the Stanford Energy Modeling Forum I work with, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which I'm on again, are all modeling. And when we model staying within 2 degrees Celsius, or even the latest report on 1.5 degrees Celsius, it shows that coal production has to go down right away. So coal consumption, and therefore coal production. So there's no justification to building a new coal mine. Now get into oil, right? And so we're less carbonaceous of the fossil fuels. Then it's tricky. There are still investments happening in oil as we deplete oil, although the total demand for oil should already be kind of peaking and starting to decline. Then there are different scenarios in which natural gas demand actually goes up for a while in some areas. And lots of natural gas is still being produced, because of course it's always being consumed. And so that's why I don't have an answer for or no, I do have an answer. My answer is that I don't have a strong position on that. And I'm happy to say, or my not having a strong position is a strong position. It's deliberate. It's based on, in my view, it's based on the evidence. Who was 3? Okay. And who was 4? We had a, okay, give her a microphone. Okay, give her a microphone then.
My name is Susan Fisher. Thank you for your talk today. I would like to believe that our government is climate sincere, but of course the catchphrase that...
Our federal government.
Yes,
Okay.
that they might be a climate
I
sincere.
think the provincial federal.
Yeah. But when Catherine McKenna and Trudeau refer to the environment, they always use the catchphrase, we're going to look after the environment and grow the economy. But I think if you are science-based, you have to face the fact that you can't have an infinitely growing economy in a finite world. While to suggest that tamping down economic growth might make you permanently unelectable, I cannot believe in the sincerity of a government that promises economic growth and environmental protection, not just on the climate front, but also in terms of biodiversity.
Thank you. My best guess from the evidence on what is economic growth and whether or not it is inevitably material-based, and this is something I study a lot, and my next book will be about this. I'm one of those very large number of scholars who believes you can have infinite economic growth and protect the environment. The material throughput of humans would go down. But how we measure economic growth, somebody inventing a way for handicapped or paralyzed people to be able to walk and produce more value in the economy, that's economic growth. So when you start to deconstruct what is economic, all of the elements of economic growth, so economic growth digs more stuff out of the ground. And so there's a linear relationship between a GDP gain and a physical throughput in our economy. That is unsustainable. But there's a huge, fantastic, rigorous research. And what I'm telling you is where my reading of it is. It could be totally wrong. You can completely disagree with me. But it's very sincere what I'm saying. And it's based on a lot of research. It doesn't mean right. Sorry. So I think that's important to point out to people. And I think that what I do with my grad students is I say, I want you to argue the very best argument for the opposite of what you just said. And that's just a good exercise for you. And that's what I do with everything. I take one thing, then I argue, and then with the students I say, that wasn't a strong argument. Give me the best argument. And so I'm just challenging you to do that. I mean, you probably already have done that. But anyway, something to think about.
There's a recent book called A Bright Future, written partly by a Swede, who says, even if we meet the Paris Accords, we will continue heating up the world. The only way to truly decarbonize quickly is through nuclear power. What's your response to that?
Right. So technically, I would argue that is incorrect. Like, humanity can get all the energy it needs without using nuclear power. At the same time, similarly to other answers I've already given, I don't have a strong position one way or the other. If a particular jurisdiction wants to use nuclear power, because right now we need to move so fast, and so China right now is building a lot of nuclear plants. I'm not thrilled with that, but they are going to use a lot of energy to get even close to sort of 1/100th or 1/10th of the energy that we use, that provides us real value, whether it's in hospitals, schools, whatever. And so I understand jurisdictions that would move forward with nuclear power. I think there'll be so I'm moving from ought to prediction. I predict very little nuclear power in industrialized countries because we're already seeing how much energy we can get from wind and solar and other renewables, and we can even back them up with natural gas. If you had natural gas plants that had to run those times when you couldn't get all the other intermittent energy sources, it's still very little CO2 emissions from an energy system. So and that would be way cheaper and in many ways, and even economically less risky than nuclear. So until I've been reading a lot lately about what do they call the small modular reactors. But there's been an exciting new nuclear development throughout my career every 5 years. So that doesn't mean I reject it, but I keep my usual skeptical eye. It's possible, but we do not have to go to nuclear for humanity to decarbonize. And when I was on the global energy assessment, we did several scenarios of the planet which had no nuclear power and still hit all the targets for greenhouse gas reduction. Who was the next one?
Thank you. You will appreciate more than most that the Liberal government's climate policy was forged in somewhat of a Faustian bargain with Alberta. It allowed Alberta a 100 million ton cap on its emissions in exchange for promoting and accepting a price on carbon. Now that that deal has fallen apart, could you rationalize for me the government's policy on buying and extending a pipeline that's currently losing us $5 million a month, and approving an LNG plant in Kitimat that's going to absorb 80% of BC's 2050 greenhouse gas targets?
So, there's a lot to unpack. Excellent question, and I'm glad you asked it. There's a lot to unpack from it. One of them is even a pipeline losing $5 million a month. I used to regulate that pipeline. I was the chair of the BC Utilities Commission in 92 to 97, and the nice thing about pipelines is they don't lose any money because the ratepayers have to cover the cost of using the pipeline. But let's not go there. Oh, I know where it was. It started out and on this sort of premise that Alberta's climate policies were part of a deal with the federal, so the federal government, quid pro quo, the federal government says we'll approve a pipeline, Alberta says we'll put in a carbon price. Am I fairly representing what you were just saying? Yeah. And maybe even Joyce might say that as well, but I disagree a little bit. I don't know if I disagree with Joyce, but to me the history was different. Because I was helping Andrew Leach a little bit. The Alberta policy was developed before Trudeau was ever even elected. So Alberta's carbon tax policy, its coal plant phase-out policy, these were all developed sort of in the spring and summer of 2015 and were finalized by October, before October. And then the federal government was elected and Alberta in December came out with its climate policy. So to me, there never really was a deal there. I know I have heard the Prime Minister, Trudeau, sort of make this link, and I was irritated that he did that, because it wasn't true. But I think Trudeau was trying to say, I'm going to get this pan-Canadian framework, and I'm going to get everybody in, and so I'm going to have to give them something to get them in. And I do understand that mindset. I mean, I wrote something in Policy Options right after he got elected. He tried to take the premiers to Paris with him, and I think he did. And I wrote and said, don't take them to Paris. Some of them will challenge you in court later on. Put in a federal policy, a regulation, whatever, get it done. It isn't something where all Canadians will agree. We have different interests, and this is what my talk was partly about. You're never going to make a deal. He played it like he made a deal, and I think that was sort of the mindset of Trudeau, was I'm not going to be a dictator. I'm going to get and work with people and compromise. So I think on climate policy, he shouldn't have done that. I understand and defend his ability to think, his thinking that way. Because who am I? Like, I'm not getting elected. It's pretty hard to get elected in a country of such diverse interests. So I can campaign on, we'll get rid of all, we'll eliminate fossil fuels in 10 years, but I won't get elected. So we've got to figure out how to make compromise. So I will defend So I'm opposed to the Trans Mountain Pipeline, I'm very clear on that, and I think the logic behind it is wrong, and yet I will defend his ability to improve that pipeline because it is trying to get compromise among Canadians. I just think he did it, I don't agree with it, but I understand it. And I don't feel righteous about what he did. I just think it's too easy to be judging people who got elected when you can see, okay, here's the sincere things, here's what I think's a mistake, da da da. Now, I think we got through and so apologies to those of you who have your hands there. I'm going to try to go over to this side now and count off people. So there was one that was still the last one in the first group, right? Yeah, how did you sneak into that? But the rest of you put your hands up with questions. So you, sir, in the white, you in the blue, great, and you, sir, you, and you. And then we'll stop there. I didn't count. Anyway, you saw when I pointed at you. Please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Jackie Giroux. I'm a constituent in this riding. I would like to ask a question of Joyce, if I may, pivoting from your comments with a question for Joyce. Would that be okay, Joyce?
Sure.
Okay. Here. Thank you for holding this discussion. We have a room full of people here feeling very anxious about climate change. I certainly know I'm very anxious. My 3 children have told me they will not have children because they are afraid of the future. We need bold climate policies and actions to fight the climate crisis. Joyce, you have the knowledge, the experience, the stage as a cabinet minister, and most importantly, I know you have the heart for this job. What Canada needs now is your voice. On behalf of thousands of citizens concerned about climate change, here's my question for you. Will you step into the spotlight?
Okay. I think she wants you to do even more. But we don't know what you're doing in cabinet. We don't know what you're arguing in cabinet. I got a taste of that.
I'm back.
Oh!
Thank you.
I was trying to fill in.
Will you step into the spotlight, stay in that spotlight, and speak out publicly and boldly to fight the climate crisis, even beyond your party platform, if necessary, which we haven't seen yet? Will you be a climate champion for us at every chance you get?
So is that just about it?
I've got some suggestions, but I think that's the big question.
Thanks.
Thank you.
The answer, Jackie, is yes. I am a climate champion and I'll continue to be a climate champion. It won't always look the way you would like or expect. At this point, I have, as the president of the Treasury Board, I have the opportunity and privilege of annoying my senior staff by every time I see a Treasury Board submission come by me, which I review before it goes to the board, to ask, where's the climate lens? Quite a few of them now have a green lens, and I'm saying that's not good enough. We have to be thinking about the climate implications of everything we do. So there are ways to be a climate champion that are not that visible. And I have to say, in working with Mark on our renewable portfolio standard in British Columbia, where I intervened on the the BC Energy Strategy consultations, I signed up to be an intervener. The Premier's Chief of Staff said, Joyce, other ministers don't usually intervene in the consultations of another minister. And I said, too bad, I'm going to do that. And got Mark to help me get the graphs and charts together to demonstrate that we could have a 100% renewable energy portfolio with every additional energy we provide for British Columbia. So, but I don't think there's a single member of the public that ever knew that or ever will know that, except you. So it's one thing to be marching and, at a protest, which I was at Burnaby talking about the pipeline, actually, before the last election. But there is a lot that can be done that is not that kind of visible, and that's what I do in every way that I know how, and I'll continue to do that, whatever position I'm in.
And I just want to add to that like we're all in different roles. I mean, there's things as an academic that I'm not allowed to do, and I even things like getting arrested, I take it very seriously. It was a huge, gut-wrenching decision for me because we are trying to be in certain roles, and my role is to make sure the media still talks to me as someone who's independent. And Joyce does no good to anybody if she's no longer in the cabinet. So she's going to have to compromise, just like every one of us would have to compromise. But I do know from experiences like the one she just recounted, how often she almost gets kicked out of the cabinet, as it was with Gordon Campbell, sort of saying to you at least, Joyce, you keep going for that, but you are irritating some of these cabinet ministers, and we have to have, and so we would do late night battles with BC Hydro in the bowels of the legislative building. So where were the next questions? My turn? Yeah.
Thanks. My name's John, and I just wanted to ask, choosing between, say, carbon pricing type options and regulatory, do you have any thoughts about which of those are more politically safe?
Right. I didn't plant him. But am I able to go, oh yeah, probably just asked me to do this, but slides. There. So, and so I'll be a bit longer in this answer, but I think it's worthwhile. So, as I said, British Columbia was a perfect quasi-experiment. So, my student, Katja Rhodes, she's now a professor in public administration at UVic. She was in the Climate Action Secretariat after she graduated with me, and she did a series of brilliant surveys of, because setting up the questions so that rigorous academics will put this in a leading journal is very tricky. She's a lot smarter than I am, so I was sort of, I get to be a third or fourth author on these papers just because I help pay her funding, but actually she won most of her funding as well. She was so talented. So anyway, what we did is I'm going to really cut short on this. What are these things? So I don't know if you remember, we had carbon neutral government, so forget about that. This is the thing that Joyce was just talking about. It's in electricity. BC Hydro, under the NDP, had a rule that, so this is in the 1999-2000, that 20% or 10% of any new supply had to be renewable. And when the Campbell government got elected and Joyce was named Environment Minister, we wanted to flip that and say we wanted to make it 100%, but maybe make it 90%. And in January of 2007, they finally implemented this thing. I think they implemented it at 90%, and then it went up to 92 or 93. It was all weird. But this is what stopped a coal plant near Princeton and another coal plant up in the Northeast, which BC Hydro had already signed letters of agreement with them. But it did not say you have to have, only wind or only solar or even renewable. You could do it with carbon capture and storage. So that was a flexible regulation. We have in BC a low carbon fuel standard. So the fuel providers have to start switching away. They have to blend more biofuels into their fuel mix, and even electricity can get credits as we're moving away from gasoline. And that's a regulation that does that. We have the carbon tax, which I think everybody knows. Then we had some regulations on efficiency in buildings that we rewrote the act, and I got involved in that. These three, carbon pricing, flexible regulations. In Katja's survey, she asked people, do you strongly support, so those who can't see the bottom, purple is strongly support, green is somewhat support, red is, or blue is strongly opposed, and red is somewhat opposed, right? And that's often a way that people will do these kind of surveys. What I want to point out is that some of my environmentalist friends would say to politicians, oh yeah, do a carbon tax, because look, 35 plus 21 is 56% of people support it, and only 23 plus 21, 44% of people oppose it. But if you're advising a cabinet minister or then a cabinet, and they're going to have to go to election, they want to know how large is the group of people who strongly oppose it. They don't want to know what's the score this way and that way. Because in our election system, there are people, I'm sure nobody here, who single issue vote, right? And there's not, lots of people do make trade-offs, but there are people who single issue vote. And Andrew Scheer has figured out, and I've got a feeling in the next provincial election, maybe Andrew Wilkinson has figured this out, is to try to really target the carbon tax and try to get some of these people to single issue vote, and that be enough to win a few key ridings in Surrey and topple the government we have now. So that's a long-winded answer, but I'm glad you asked that. You're satisfied with it. It's that kind of a challenge. Now that's why Bernie Sanders has really emphasized this kind of policy. And that's sort of, and Obama had to do that anyway because he had to get Congress to do some kind of tax and carbon pricing. So Obama had to work in this space. Okay, that was a long answer, but that's one area I wanted to cover in this talk. So who were the next ones that I had already had their hands up? You did. And okay, so you go first and then.
Hi, just before I say what I'm going to say, I want to just say out loud that I've always voted Liberal and I'm going to vote for Joyce next time like I did vote for Joyce last time. I want to revisit your characterization and I want to revisit your characterization of Stephen Harper as a liar. As you well know and we know, in 2007, Harper made a commitment to cap greenhouse gas emissions and said to the National Roundtable on Environment and Economy, give me a plan. And at the time you were on the board of the Roundtable, and the plan that you guys produced in 2009 for Prime Minister Harper relied heavily on one side of the model, the Sims model, the Gene model, the Sims model that you control. And that plan is still in the public domain. And in that plan, you said three things. One of the things that you prescribed in the plan was the construction of 2.5 Site C equivalents worth of new hydro capacity every single year for 30 years, starting in 2010. I fast forward to 2015-16 when Chris talked, it's in the public domain, anybody can look it up. Yeah. It's called Achieving 2050. It's called Achieving 2050. I can make my card and send you a copy.
No, you can get a copy online.
Yes, you can. And so 2015-16, we go ahead, Chris Dave Sawyer running the decarbonization plan, and there again, you're prescribing 2 site equivalents of large hydro, starting construction in 2020 for another 30 years. Do you absolutely believe that a sincere Canadian Prime Minister will commit to that?
So it doesn't do, I'm sorry, actually now I know who you are, and you were incorrect, and we checked all of that, so you're using this venue to once again say that. You can go and look at this online.
Please look it online, I'm telling you.
What it will do, what we do need to do, is we need to electrify. And that's why I did argue in the Site C hearing. I took work from Chris Bataille, that's true, in the deep decarbonization project that's run from, this is just last 2 years, so this isn't 10 years ago. So in the last 2 years, we just looked at Site C, and when the Utilities Commission said, oh, we don't need Site C, we said, okay, but if you're doing deep decarbonization, you don't have to build Site C, but you're going to have to do enough wind and solar to do Site Cs. Canada-wide, so it isn't the BC, like it sounds big, Site C in BC. It isn't. It's the amount of electricity you need Canada-wide to not destroy the planet. You need a lot of electricity because it's the electricity that's mostly going to move us around. It's the electricity in our houses, and I certainly stand by that. But the work we did for Stephen Harper, Harper said, and he never said that he rejected the targets. Anyway, he gave us the targets, and the roundtable, which was headed by, or the lead person who signed on and worked with me, is the head of Suncor. I forget his name now. Steve Williams. So Steve Williams and I, the analysis was done by others, and when you said the Sims model I control, people are using it all over the world, in Berlin, Washington, D.C. it's a model I give freely to anyone because I developed it with university funding. Okay, I'll go on to the next question.
Thanks, Mark. This has been great. I have more of a question that's related to technology as compared to politics. You mentioned that you know David Keith.
And you also mentioned that no one country can solve the global warming problem. David Keith, through geoengineering, has all sorts of ideas that any one country can do if they wanted to do it. And I'd just like to get your comment on that.
Thank you. So, but David Keith, I'm going to just slightly adjust what you said, and maybe you'll see it as a friendly amendment. David Keith would not say that would solve the global warming problem. So if you read his book, he says, because we haven't addressed greenhouse gas emissions, we should be studying all sorts of things as we're starting to have mass migrations, mass deaths. We're going to have to, people like me, David Keith, a very smart physicist who really knows economics and engineering, should be, as a responsible academic, working on the technologies that we may need to have on fairly short order. And so that's what he's doing. And in the case of carbon engineering, as I said, it would be something, it's a technology that would, so just think, we've gone from, let's say, 280 parts per million CO2 to over 400. That's still a minuscule amount, what is it, point something %. How do you get, so it's one thing for CO2 to be in the smokestack of a coal plant. There's a lot of CO2 there, maybe it's 6% or something. So you have technologies that can use lime and alkaline solutions to try to capture the CO2. How do you get CO2 out of the atmosphere? You're going to have to pump a lot of CO2 through these, and then have these kind of washes that will be able to extract the CO2. And so I invite anyone to Google carbon engineering. And I just want to say, though, that someone like David would not say, this is the answer, or I'm trying to make money on this. It is literally, as a responsible academic with that kind of expertise, what should I be doing? And that's why Bill Gates is funding it. Bill Gates is also funding all sorts of research on renewables, on battery storage, and also on nuclear power. So Bill Gates is just someone who got people like David to scan around. And one of the things we need to do, though, is think about how to make ice on Greenland, how to reflect solar radiation, how to deacidify the ocean. It's going to be, the Anthropocene is heading into a phase, you better be used to it now, of massive engineering of the Earth. Because we have massively engineered the Earth in a bad way.
So Mark, maybe one more short question and then we'll wrap so that we are done on time.
Darn. All right. Some of you can cluster around me afterwards, yeah, we've taken up our time. Where did we had an order here, darn it.
It was already asked.
Okay, and you were last? Okay, she says she was last. Clever. All right. No, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not that smart. I look to renewables as the only viable option that we have, and I recognize the political sagacity of not undermining the voter base, but nonetheless we'll all go down in 10 years if we haven't done something significantly different. So can you speak to, even with the carbon tax, you said at one point that we need carbon tax in order to fund the renewables, but I so rarely see the correlation even between the two. And what can we do?
I didn't say that, because I don't believe it.
Oh, you said you can't. Well, I think you referred to a politician that talked about renewables, but not having carbon tax, and so there did seem to be a correlation there. I just would like you to address the renewables and how we can really put everything and all our efforts behind renewable energy.
Right. So my answer to that is, nobody, I think, said this more than Obama, but it's a long saying, don't let perfection be the enemy of the good. my response to you is that it's too late for you and I to say I can only have renewables. That I think we can't afford to allow ourselves to be indulgent. And so I would say, why are you being indulgent? Like, why aren't you saying, oh, if somebody can use fossil fuels and capture the CO2 and we can get buy-in from people who would have otherwise tried to stop us, why would you oppose that? If the Chinese want to do some nuclear power and it looks like the Atomic Energy Agency is feeling fairly good about their safety mechanisms, I just think you and I are not in a position to be purists anymore. I do believe that a deep decarbonization will be predominantly humans using renewable energy. And I believe all those renewable energy forms will have negative consequences, environmental, social. There is no such thing as green or clean energy. They all have trade-offs. We need to get to zero emission. And to get to zero emission, I'm willing to make all sorts of trade-offs, and I invite all of you to be that way. And that will be, again, to do what I do to my grad students in the very first 2 weeks, is to argue the opposite of anything you passionately believe. I mean, you can argue the opposite of that we're changing the climate, but I don't see the point. The science is very firm on that. But I'm talking about the strategies. Like, I run into people who say you have to have a carbon tax. So we'll argue the opposite of that. You don't. You know, we have to have only renewables. We cannot do geoengineering. We cannot do carbon capture storage. We cannot do nuclear power. And I just invite everyone to challenge yourself on your purest thoughts, legitimate as they are, because I think it'll mostly be renewables. I think they're the best option in so many places, but not everywhere. And so maybe that's a good way for me to close with that thought, is part of my whole appeal. And a lot of the book is about that, is about all of us challenging ourselves so we can do a better job as citizens in making sure we get climate-sincere politicians who will actually make that change, because most likely we're going to fail. So that means you have to be really demanding on yourself. We have been failing, and so how do we stop failing? Thank you very much for your attention.
Is this on? Can you hear me? Yeah, I just really want to thank you, Mark, for someone of your stature and experience to come and share your knowledge and understanding and commitment on this issue. So thank you. That's, I'll be asking you again. For being here, because it's without people who are committed and thoughtful and willing to dedicate time to learning and to speaking about your convictions on climate, we would not be able to do what we are doing. And I think that it's very clear from Mark's talk that the more citizens understand and have that commitment and understanding and are willing to communicate with your friends, especially with an election coming up, it is important that people realize that climate is a critical consideration. So what you're doing is very important just through that commitment. The more people who understand the complexities that Mark has laid out and care about it, the further and faster a government can go. And so that is what I tell. When people come to me and say, you know, please, I want you to do this or that and do it faster, I say, yes, I want that. And what it takes is that more people like you feel that way. So we're working together on this. It's going to be an increasingly, I think, urgent and intense conversation as years go by, and I am really privileged to represent a community that cares about and understands this issue. So thank you. And lastly, I want to thank my staff and volunteers for doing all of the organizational work to make this very well-attended town hall happen. And to those on Facebook Live, thank you for being interested and for participating as well. So enjoy the rest of your Saturday. Thanks very much.